The stew was unnervingly dark, not the deep, comforting brown of a slow-cooked beef or venison broth, but a murky, almost black liquid that clung to the spoon with a viscous, unnatural weight. The traveler, a man named Silas Croft, had been on the road for 3 weeks, his journey carving a path through the unforgiving wilderness of the Missouri Ozarks in the year of our Lord, 1857. He was bone-weary, his stomach a hollow cavern of hunger. The remote tavern, a crudely built log structure nestled in a dense hollow, had appeared like a mirage, its flickering lantern light a beacon of hope against the encroaching twilight. Inside, one of the proprietors, a large, unnervingly quiet man who moved with the heavy grace of a predator, had ladled the stew into his bowl without a word. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something coppery and sweet that sat heavy at the back of the throat. Croft raised the spoon to his lips, the aroma intensifying. It was rich, gamey, but with an undercurrent he couldn't quite place. He took a hesitant bite. The meat was tender, falling apart, yet its texture was unfamiliar. It wasn't beef. It wasn't pork. It certainly wasn't venison. A strange, metallic tang coated his tongue, a flavor that seemed to whisper of things forbidden and primal. He looked up, scanning the dimly lit common room. At the bar, the other proprietor, this one more talkative with a smile that never quite reached his cold, watchful eyes, was polishing a glass, observing him. Every instinct in Silas Croft's body, honed by a life on the perilous frontier, suddenly screamed. The warmth of the fire, the promise of shelter, it all evaporated, replaced by an icy, creeping dread. He was not just a customer here. He was being evaluated. He slowly lowered his spoon. His appetite vanished, the horrifying truth of the stew's secret ingredient beginning to dawn on him in the deepest, most macabre corners of his mind. The silence in the Finch Tavern was a living thing. It pressed in on Silas Croft from the dark-stained log walls, from the shadowy corners where the firelight dared not venture. The smiling brother who called himself Elias finally spoke, his voice a smooth, honeyed drawl that did nothing to soothe the frantic pounding in Croft's chest. "Not to your liking, friend?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the half-eaten bowl. "Our stew is famous in these parts, a family recipe, warms the soul on a cold night." Croft forced a swallow, the metallic taste seeming to crawl down his esophagus. He could feel the other brother, the silent giant named Samuel, watching him from the kitchen doorway. The man's eyes were flat, emotionless, like chips of obsidian. There were no other travelers in the common room. The realization hit Croft with the force of a physical blow. He had ridden for 2 days without seeing another soul on this isolated stretch of trail. How could a stew be famous in these parts when there were no parts to speak of? Just endless, rolling hills of ancient forest and shadow. This place wasn't a haven, it was a web, and he had just blundered straight into its center. He had to leave. Now, he fumbled in his coat for a few coins, his fingers clumsy with a sudden tremor. "It's fine," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Just tired from the road, lost my appetite." He pushed the coins across the rough-hewn table, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Elias' smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Oh, but you must finish," he insisted, his tone hardening just enough to betray the sinister intent beneath. "Waste not, want not, that's the rule of the frontier, and it's the rule in this house." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the table, right next to the bowl of disturbing, blood-dark stew. The door was 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. Croft's mind raced, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his journey had just come to a horrifying, unspeakable end. The Missouri Ozarks of the 1850s were a land of brutal contradictions. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, where ancient, forest-clad mountains rolled like a petrified green ocean under an endless sky. It was a land of promise, a gateway to the West, where countless settlers, prospectors, and dreamers passed through on their way to a new life in the territories. But beneath this veneer of natural splendor and pioneering hope lay a darker, more menacing truth. This was a frontier in the truest sense of the word. A lawless, untamed wilderness where civilization was a fragile outpost and survival was a daily struggle against the elements, against starvation, and most terrifyingly against other men. Justice was often a distant concept, dispensed by a lone, overworked marshal hundreds of miles away. Disappearances were tragically common. A man could be taken by a sudden fever, a venomous snake, a misplaced step on a rocky cliff, or the unforgiving current of a swollen river. Entire families vanished, their wagons found months later, reclaimed by the wilderness, their fates becoming cautionary tales whispered around campfires. It was a place where people learned to be self-reliant, but also deeply suspicious. A friendly face could mask the most sinister of intentions. Every stranger was a potential threat, every remote cabin a potential den of thieves. This pervasive atmosphere of isolation and paranoia was the fertile ground in which the most macabre legends were sown. And in 1857, along a lonely, seldom-traveled trail deep in the heart of the Ozark Highlands, the darkest legend of all was taking root. It centered on a secluded tavern, a place that offered respite to the weary traveler, run by two brothers whose hospitality was said to be unmatched, but whose pantry held a horrifying, forbidden secret. The Finch Brothers' Tavern had no name. It didn't need one. For travelers making the arduous trek through that particular stretch of wilderness, it was simply the only place, the only sign of human life for 50 miles in either direction. It was built in a deep, shaded hollow, almost invisible from the main trail until you were nearly upon it. The structure itself was imposing, built from massive, dark-barked oak logs, with a low-slung roof and small, deep-set windows that resembled vacant, staring eyes. A plume of smoke perpetually curled from its stone chimney, a signal of warmth and food that was impossible for a half-starved traveler to ignore. But the tavern's isolation was both its greatest appeal and its most disturbing feature. It was a world unto itself, governed by its own rules, far from the prying eyes of the law or the judgment of any community. Sounds from the tavern, a burst of laughter, the clang of a pot, were swallowed by the dense, ancient forest that crowded in on all sides. The trees themselves seemed to be complicit, their thick canopy creating a perpetual twilight around the property, their silence guarding the secrets that transpired within the log walls. Locals from the nearest settlement, a full day's ride away, spoke of the place in hushed tones. They called it the Hollow of the Lost, a place where the unwary vanished from the face of the earth. They warned their children not to wander too far into the woods in that direction, spinning tales of a curse that haunted the land. But for the desperate traveler, cold, hungry, and exhausted, the sight of that chimney smoke was a siren's call, promising a hot meal and a soft bed. It was a promise the Finch brothers were always happy to keep, but it came at a terrible, unimaginable price. The tavern was not a business. It was a hunting ground, and the bait was the illusion of sanctuary. The brothers themselves were as much a part of the tavern's unsettling aura as the building itself. Elias and Samuel Finch were a study in contrasts, two halves of a single, sinister whole. Elias was the face of the operation. He was of average height and build, with a quick smile, a disarming charm, and a voice that could coax the story out of the most tight-lipped traveler. He was the one who greeted guests at the door, who poured the ale, who sat with them by the fire, and listened to their tales of the trail and their dreams of the West. He had a way of making a man feel seen, understood, and most importantly, safe. He would learn their names, their destinations, and whether they were traveling alone or expecting to meet someone. He gathered information with the casual skill of a master interrogator, all while maintaining the facade of a genial and welcoming host. His questions seemed born of simple, friendly curiosity, but they were precise, calculated tools used to assess the vulnerability of his prey. He was the lure, the friendly face that drew victims into the web. Samuel, on the other hand, was the tavern's lurking shadow. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with hands that looked capable of snapping a man's neck as easily as a dry twig. He rarely spoke, communicating with Elias through a series of subtle glances and almost imperceptible nods. His domain was the kitchen and the smokehouse out back. He was the one who butchered the meat, who tended the fires, who stirred the great black cauldron of stew that was always bubbling over the hearth. Travelers would catch glimpses of him through the kitchen doorway, a large, hulking silhouette moving in the firelight, his face perpetually obscured by shadow. His silence was profoundly unnerving, a heavy, menacing presence that filled the room. While Elias charmed, Samuel watched, his flat, dead eyes missing nothing. Together, they formed a perfectly efficient, horrifyingly symbiotic partnership. The stew was the heart of the Finch Tavern. It was their one and only specialty. No matter the time of day or night a traveler arrived, a steaming bowl was always ready, ladled from the massive iron pot that hung permanently over the common room's hearth. For those who had subsisted on hardtack and dried jerky for weeks, its rich, savory aroma was intoxicating. Elias proudly claimed it was a recipe passed down through generations, a hearty, nourishing meal designed to put the strength back in a man's bones. He would boast that its ingredients were a closely guarded secret, known only to him and his brother. The secret, he'd say with a wink, was the unique blend of wild herbs and spices, foraged from the deepest parts of the surrounding Ozark forest. But whispers among those who survived their stay at the tavern told a different story. Some who ate the stew spoke of falling into a deep, unnaturally heavy sleep, waking up hours later feeling groggy and disoriented, their heads pounding. Others mentioned the stew's unsettling effects on their digestion, leaving them feeling sick and weak for days afterward. And then there was the taste. While initially savory, many recalled a strange, lingering aftertaste, a distinct, coppery tang that coated the palate. It was a flavor that was both rich and vaguely nauseating, a taste that, once experienced, was impossible to forget. Rumors began to circulate on the frontier trails, passed in hushed tones from one traveler to another. They called it the bloody stew or the stew of vanishing men. They said the brothers never seemed to need to hunt or buy livestock, yet their pot was always full. They said the secret ingredient wasn't an herb or a spice, but something far more macabre. The legend of the stew grew with each traveler who checked into the Finch Tavern and was never seen again. A horrifying tale of forbidden hospitality and a recipe written in blood. Jedediah Kane was the first to be missed. He was a seasoned prospector, a loner by nature, with a quiet demeanor and eyes that held the glint of gold fever. He had passed through the nearby settlement of Pine Ridge in the spring of 1856, stocking up on supplies before heading into the hills. He told the general store owner he was following a promising map to a silver deposit deep in the Ozark interior. He was a cautious man, not one to take foolish risks. He knew the dangers of the wilderness. He was expected back in Pine Ridge before the first winter snow, but winter came and went, and the snows melted, and still, there was no sign of Jedediah Kane. At first, no one thought much of it. Prospectors were a transient bunch, often chasing rumors and whims. Perhaps he'd struck it rich and moved on to St. Louis, or perhaps he'd fallen victim to one of the 1,000 natural perils the Ozarks held. His disappearance was noted, lamented, and then largely forgotten. But the following summer, a family of German immigrants, the Schmidts, also vanished along the same stretch of trail. Their wagon was found a few months later, pulled off into a thicket, the oxen long gone. Their belongings were still inside, seemingly untouched, tools, clothes, even a small, leather-bound Bible resting on the seat. But of Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt and their 2 young children there was no trace. It was as if they had been plucked from the earth. Now a pattern was beginning to emerge, a dark geography of disappearance centered on that one isolated trail, the same trail where the Finch brothers' tavern offered its lonely welcome. The people of Pine Ridge started to connect the dots, their unease solidifying into a cold, creeping fear. The trail was becoming known as a place of no return, a banned route that sensible folk avoided. The wilderness was dangerous, yes, but this felt different. This felt like the work of a calculating, human evil. Marshall Brody Yates of Springfield was a man carved from the hard granite of the frontier. He was pragmatic, methodical, and deeply skeptical of the ghost stories and folk tales that were the currency of conversation in the isolated Ozarks settlements. When the first reports of the vanishings reached him, carried by a nervous circuit preacher, he initially dismissed them as tragic but unremarkable incidents. The frontier was a maw that swallowed people whole. It was the grim reality of his jurisdiction. He had seen firsthand what a harsh winter, a sudden illness, or a simple lack of preparedness could do. He filed the reports and moved on to more pressing matters: land disputes, cattle rustlers, and saloon brawls that ended in bloodshed. These were tangible crimes with evidence and witnesses, not shadowy rumors about a cursed trail. However, the reports kept coming. A peddler known for his distinctive tin whistle, a young couple eloping to the west, a solitary land surveyor, all gone without a trace, all last seen heading toward the same remote hollow. The sheer number of missing persons from one specific area began to gnaw at Marshal Yates' pragmatic sensibilities. It was too many, too coincidental. He pulled out a map of the territory, marking the location of each disappearance. They formed a chilling constellation, with the darkest point of concentration right in the vicinity of the unnamed tavern he'd heard whispers about. His skepticism began to curdle into professional concern. This was no longer just a collection of unfortunate accidents. It was a statistical anomaly, a cluster of vanishings that defied logical explanation. Against his better judgment, Marshal Yates decided it was time to ride out to Pine Ridge and ask some questions himself. He still didn't believe in curses, but he did believe in predators, and he was beginning to suspect that a particularly cunning and patient pair had made their den deep in the Ozark woods. Upon arriving in Pine Ridge, Marshal Yates found a community steeped in fear. The townsfolk spoke in hushed, anxious tones, glancing over their shoulders as if the very trees had ears. When he mentioned the Finch Tavern, a wall of silence went up. People would suddenly remember urgent chores, their eyes would dart away, and conversations would die. It was a communal terror so thick he could almost taste it. He learned that no one from Pine Ridge ever went to the tavern. They didn't trade with the brothers, they didn't socialize with them, and they warned any newcomers to steer clear of the place. The tavern existed in a state of self-imposed quarantine, shunned by the locals as if it were a leper colony. The blacksmith told him a disturbing story of a trapper who had stumbled out of the woods near the tavern a year prior, pale and feverish. The trapper claimed he had taken a meal there and had fallen violently ill. He spoke of the strange, coppery taste of the stew and the unnerving, watchful silence of the larger brother, Samuel. The trapper had died 2 days later, his ravings dismissed as the product of a fevered mind. The general store owner recounted how the Finch brothers never bought meat. Not once in the 5 years they had been running the tavern had they purchased salted pork, beef, or even a single chicken. They bought flour, salt, coffee, and whiskey, paying in a strange assortment of coins, some old and foreign, but never meat. They have a smokehouse, the owner said, his voice barely a whisper. Always smoking, but they have no cattle, no pigs, they don't seem to hunt. So what in God's name are they smoking in there? The question hung in the dusty air of the store, pregnant with horrifying implication. Yates was a man of logic, but the collective fear of an entire town was a powerful piece of evidence in itself. Marshal Yates decided to conduct a subtle reconnaissance. He wasn't ready to make a formal accusation. He had nothing but hearsay and a bad feeling. He rode a parallel ridge that overlooked the hollow where the tavern was situated, using a spyglass to observe the property from a safe distance. For 2 days he watched. The place was just as isolated as described. The tavern and a large, windowless smokehouse were the only buildings, enclosed by a crude split-rail fence. What struck him immediately was the smoke. Just as the store owner had said, a thick, greasy-smelling plume rose steadily from the smokehouse chimney, day and night. It was a constant, almost industrial output of smoke that seemed excessive for a simple tavern. He saw the brothers. Elias moved about the front of the property, tending to chores with a relaxed, easy-going manner. Samuel, however, was a figure of relentless industry. He hauled wood, tended the smokehouse fire, and carried heavy burlap-wrapped bundles from a small cart into the dark interior of the smokehouse. Yates couldn't make out what was in the bundles, but they were large and irregularly shaped. During his 2-day watch, 3 separate travelers arrived at the tavern, a lone man on horseback and later a couple in a small wagon. Elias greeted each of them with his characteristic wide smile, welcoming them inside. Yates waited. He watched the sun set and the lanterns in the tavern windows glow. He watched the moon rise high in the sky. He waited for the travelers to emerge the next morning to continue their journey. They never did. The horse was led into the small barn. The wagon was pulled behind the smokehouse out of sight. But the people themselves, they simply vanished into the dark-timbered tavern and were not seen again. The bad feeling in the marshal's gut had now hardened into a cold, terrifying certainty. The tavern was not a resting place. It was a final destination. As Marshal Yates began to dig deeper, the folklore surrounding the Finch brothers started to reveal its horrifying origins. He sought out the oldest residents in the surrounding hills, the hermits and recluses who knew the land and its history better than anyone. An elderly woman, whose family had settled in the Ozarks generations ago, told him a story that chilled him to the bone. She said the Finch brothers weren't the first of their kind to occupy that hollow. Their father, Old Man Finch, had built the original cabin on that spot decades earlier. He was a deeply strange and reclusive man, known for his violent temper and his rumored practice of forbidden folk magic. He was ostracized by the small communities of the time, and he and his 2 young sons lived in complete isolation. The old woman claimed that during a particularly brutal winter, when game was scarce and many settlers were on the brink of starvation, Old Man Finch's cabin always had smoke rising from its chimney, and the smell of roasting meat would drift on the wind, a smell that was described as unnaturally sweet. Several trappers who went missing that winter were rumored to have last been seen heading towards Finch's Hollow. The story had been dismissed as a fearful superstition, a way to explain the unexplainable hardships of frontier life. But now, hearing it in the context of the recent disappearances, it took on a new and sinister meaning. Was it possible that this wasn't just a simple case of robbery and murder? Was this a generational sickness, a macabre tradition passed down from father to son? The idea was monstrous, almost unthinkable. The evil in that hollow wasn't new. It was old. It was inherited. And the family recipe Elias Finch boasted about was a legacy of unimaginable horror. This was the sort of forbidden history that gets buried by time, a dark tale that festers in the shadows of folklore. If you find these forgotten stories as compelling as we do, take a moment to subscribe. Because the secrets Marshal Yates was about to unearth are far more disturbing than any rumor. The turning point in Marshal Yates' unofficial investigation came from a most unlikely source, a young boy hunting for squirrels in the woods. The boy, son of a farmer from the outskirts of Pine Ridge, had wandered farther than he was supposed to, drawn by the chase into the dense forest that bordered the Finch brothers' property. Hiding in a thicket, he saw the larger brother, Samuel, emerge from the back of the tavern. He was dragging a large, heavy canvas sack toward a freshly dug pit near the wood's line. The boy watched, his heart pounding, as Samuel unceremoniously dumped the contents of the sack into the hole. It was a collection of travelers' clothes, a man's worn leather coat, a woman's blue gingham dress, a pair of small, scuffed boots. Samuel then doused the pile with something from a jug and set it ablaze. As the flames consumed the clothing, something glinted in the firelight. After Samuel had gone back inside, the boy, driven by a morbid curiosity, crept forward to the edge of the smoldering pit. The smell was acrid and unpleasant. Most of the items were charred beyond recognition, but near the edge of the pit, kicked away from the main pile, was a small silver locket now tarnished by the heat. He picked it up. It was warm to the touch. He managed to pry it open. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, a smiling young man and a woman with kind eyes. The boy recognized them immediately. He had seen the couple when their wagon passed by his family's farm a few weeks earlier. They had stopped for water and had given him a piece of candy. He ran home as fast as his legs could carry him, the silver locket clutched in his hand, the horrifying truth of what he had witnessed burning in his mind. When the boy's father brought the locket to Marshal Yates, it was the first piece of concrete physical evidence he had. It was a direct link between a missing person, the young woman from the eloping couple, and the Finch brothers' property. The story of the burning clothes corroborated his own observations and the town's deepest fears. There was no more room for doubt, no more dismissing the stories as folklore. This was a cold, hard case of murder, and likely many of them. Yet Yates knew he had to proceed with extreme caution. The Finch brothers were isolated, but they were also on their own land. A direct raid without an airtight case could be seen as an overreach of his authority, especially if they found nothing. More importantly, the brothers themselves were a dangerous unknown. Elias was cunning, and Samuel was a man of formidable physical strength. A clumsy approach could get him and anyone with him killed. Yates decided his next step would be to confront them directly, not with an accusation, but with a carefully constructed pretext. He would go to the tavern himself, posing as a weary traveler. He wanted to look these men in the eye, to gauge their reactions, to see the inside of the place for himself. He needed to feel the evil of that place firsthand, to confirm the truth that his gut and his evidence were screaming at him. He cleaned his Colt revolver, checked his ammunition, and told the boy's father to quietly gather a few trustworthy men from Pine Ridge and wait for his return. If he wasn't back in 24 hours, they were to come in force. It was a risky, desperate gambit, but Yates knew it was the only way. He had to step into the spider's web to know for sure how it was spun. Riding up to the Finch Tavern, Marshal Yates felt a profound sense of unease settle over him. The place looked even more menacing up close. The log walls seemed to soak up the daylight, and the air in the hollow was still and heavy, smelling of damp earth and the greasy smoke that still curled from the smokehouse chimney. As he dismounted, the tavern door creaked open, and Elias Finch stepped out, wiping his hands on an apron. He wore the same practiced, welcoming smile Yates had observed through his spyglass. "Welcome, traveler," Elias called out, his voice smooth as polished river stone. "You look weary from the road. Come in, come in. We've a warm fire and a hot stew that'll cure what ails you." Yates played his part, mumbling his thanks and inventing a story about surveying land for the railroad. He stepped inside. The common room was just as the rumors described, dark, rustic, and dominated by a large stone hearth where a massive black cauldron bubbled. The hulking form of Samuel was visible in the kitchen doorway, stirring the pot with a paddle-sized ladle. He didn't look up, but Yates could feel the man's attention on him, a heavy, palpable weight. Elias motioned for him to sit at a table. "A bowl of our famous stew for you, then," he asked. "On the house for a man doing such important work." Yates' stomach turned. The smell from the pot was rich and savory, but now, knowing what he knew, it was the smell of death. "No, thank you," Yates said, forcing a casual tone. "Just an ale. I have a weak stomach for rich foods." Elias' smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. It was a flicker of disappointment, perhaps even suspicion. The friendly host facade cracked, and for a moment Yates saw the cold, calculating predator beneath. The tension in the room was electric. As Elias poured the ale, Marshal Yates scanned the common room, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the floorboards, some of which were darker stained than others, especially in a path leading from the main room to the kitchen. He saw the collection of mismatched mugs and plates, likely taken from previous guests. He noticed the complete absence of any personal touches, no family portraits, no decorations, nothing to suggest this was a home. It was a purely functional space, a stage set for a recurring, horrifying play. Elias brought the ale and sat down opposite him, his charm switched back on. "Surveying, you say? That's lonely work. You must see all sorts of things out in these hills." It was a fishing expedition. Elias was probing, trying to ascertain if Yates was truly alone, if he had seen anything he shouldn't have. Yates kept his answers vague, speaking of terrain and rock formations. All the while, he was acutely aware of Samuel, who had stopped stirring the pot and now stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, a silent, ominous sentinel. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. Yates felt like he was in a cage with two beasts who were deciding whether he was a threat or a meal. He decided to push to see how they would react. "I'm looking for a man," Yates said, his voice level. "A prospector named Jedediah Kane. Passed this way last year. Thought he might have stopped here." Elia's face became a perfect mask of polite confusion. "Kane. Can't say I recall the name. We see so many faces, they all tend to blur together." It was a smooth, practiced lie. But as he spoke, Yates saw Samuel's hand clench into a fist at his side. He had struck a nerve. The brothers exchanged a glance, a communication so swift and subtle it was almost invisible. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from suspicious to hostile. The test was over. They knew he wasn't who he said he was. Marshal Yates knew he had overplayed his hand. The thin veneer of civility had shattered. The air was now cold and sharp with menace. Elia's smile was gone, replaced by a flat, predatory stare. "You know," Elia said, his voice losing its friendly drawl and taking on a hard, dangerous edge, "it's not wise to go around asking questions in these parts. People can get the wrong idea. This is a place where folks like to be left alone." It was a clear, unambiguous threat. Yates slowly finished his ale, his mind racing. His hand rested casually on his thigh, inches from the butt of his Colt. He had got what he came for. He had seen the darkness in their eyes, felt the palpable evil of the place. Now he just had to get out alive. "You're right," Yates said, standing up slowly and placing a coin on the table. "My apologies for disturbing your peace." He turned and walked toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming. He could feel their eyes on his back, two pairs of predatory eyes tracking his every move. He expected a blow from behind, the crash of a chair, the lunge of the silent giant, Samuel. The 20 feet to the door felt like a mile-long gauntlet. His hand hovered over his revolver. He reached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled the heavy wooden door open and stepped out into the fading daylight, the cool air hitting his face like a splash of water. He didn't look back. He calmly walked to his horse, untied the reins, and swung himself into the saddle. Only when he was 100 yards down the trail, hidden by the first bend in the trees, did he dare to spur his horse into a full gallop, the horrifying silence of the Finch Tavern finally breaking behind him. He had walked into the lion's den, and against all odds had walked out again. Now he was coming back with fire and steel. The ride back to Pine Ridge was a blur of adrenaline and grim determination. When Marshal Yates galloped into town, his face set like stone, the waiting men knew immediately that their worst fears were true. There was no need for a lengthy explanation. The authority in the marshal's voice and the cold fire in his eyes were enough. He deputized 10 men on the spot, farmers, a blacksmith, a store owner, ordinary men forced into an extraordinary, terrifying duty. They were not lawmen, but they were husbands and fathers, and the creeping dread that had haunted their town for years had now been given a face and a name. They would not let it fester any longer. They gathered their rifles and shotguns, their lanterns and their courage, preparing to march on the heart of the darkness that had taken root in their woods. As they prepared, word spread through the small settlement. Doors were bolted and prayers were whispered. This was more than a posse riding out to capture criminals. It felt like an exorcism. They were going to confront a long-festering evil, to cut out the cancer that had been preying on the innocent and the unwary. The marshal knew he was about to lead these simple men into a nightmare from which there was no waking. What they would find in that tavern, in that smokehouse, in that cellar, was a truth that had been banned from local history books for over a century. A truth so macabre and so disturbing that its discovery would forever stain the soul of their community. We are about to unearth that forbidden history. The raid on the Finch Tavern was set for dawn. They moved through the pre-dawn forest like ghosts, the only sounds the soft crunch of leaves under their boots and the ragged, nervous breaths of the men. Marshal Yates led them along the same ridge he had used for his reconnaissance, approaching the hollow from above. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, they saw it below them. The tavern, silent and dark, with that single, constant plume of smoke rising from the smokehouse into the still morning air. The place looked deceptively peaceful, almost domestic, but the men of the posse knew better. They could feel the malevolence radiating from it, a palpable chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Yates laid out the plan in a hushed whisper. They would surround the property, cutting off all avenues of escape. On his signal, they would move in. There would be no warning, no call for surrender. The time for talking was over. These men were beyond redemption. The goal was to take them alive if possible, to force them to face justice for their horrifying crimes, but no one was under any illusion. The Finch brothers would not be taken easily. As the men fanned out to take their positions, a heavy silence fell over the group. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, grappling with the horror they were about to confront. They were about to peel back the veneer of civilization and stare into an abyss of human depravity. The sun began to crest the eastern ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the hollow. It was time. Marshal Yates took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and gave the signal. The ghosts of the forest descended into the hollow, ready to drag its demons into the light. The raid began with a terrifying, coordinated violence. On the marshal's signal, two of the strongest men charged the tavern door with a heavy log they had carried, using it as a battering ram. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the door burst inward. Marshal Yates and 5 others stormed into the common room, their rifles raised, shouting for the brothers to surrender. The scene that greeted them was surreal. The great cauldron of stew was still simmering over the glowing embers of the fire. And sitting at a table as if they had been expecting them were Elias and Samuel Finch. They were not asleep. They were not surprised. They were simply waiting. Elias had a half-empty mug of coffee in his hand. Samuel sat perfectly still, his massive hands resting flat on the table. Neither of them flinched at the intrusion. Elias looked up at Marshal Yates, and a slow, unnerving smile spread across his face. "Marshal," he said, his voice calm and conversational. "We were wondering when you'd be back. You didn't finish your ale." The sheer audacity, the complete lack of fear, was more chilling than any violent resistance. It was the calm of monsters who had no fear of men. From outside, a shout went up. The other members of the posse had breached the smokehouse. Then came a strangled cry, followed by the sound of a man retching violently. The horror had truly begun. In the common room, Samuel slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He simply turned and looked at Yates, and in his dead, black eyes there was a look of profound, almost triumphant evil. He knew what they were about to find. While Marshal Yates held the unnervingly calm brothers at gunpoint in the common room, the sounds of horror from outside grew louder. The blacksmith, a man known for his strong stomach and steady nerves, stumbled back out of the smokehouse, his face the color of ash. He leaned against the exterior wall, gasping for air. "Marshal," he choked out, "you need to see this. God help us all, you need to see this." Leaving 2 men to guard the Finches, Yates walked grimly toward the smokehouse. The smell hit him from 20 feet away, a sickeningly sweet, rancid odor of smoked meat, overlaid with the unmistakable, coppery scent of old blood. It was a smell that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the slivers of daylight forcing their way through the cracks in the walls. Hanging from the rafters on long, iron hooks were rows upon rows of smoked meats. But it was immediately, horrifyingly clear that this was not pork or beef. The shapes were disturbingly familiar. Long, slender cuts that resembled human limbs. Larger, broader slabs that could only have been cut from a human torso. It was a larder of butchered humanity, preserved and stored with the methodical skill of a master butcher. On a large wooden table in the center of the room lay the tools of this macabre trade: cleavers, saws, and long knives, all stained with old, dried blood. It was a scene of such organized, industrial-scale depravity that Yates' mind struggled to comprehend it. This was not the work of simple robbers. This was something far more ancient, far more forbidden. The rumors, the folklore, the whispers, they were all true, but the reality was infinitely more horrifying. The discoveries grew more macabre with every passing minute. Behind the smokehouse, they found the wagon belonging to the eloping couple, hidden under a pile of brush. Inside, their belongings were neatly stacked as if ready for sale. The brothers were not just murderers, they were thieves, stripping their victims of every last possession. Another group of men, searching the barn, found the missing prospector Jedediah Kane's horse, its brand clearly visible. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In the corner of the common room, hidden beneath a bearskin rug, the posse found a trapdoor. It was heavy and bolted from the outside. With a collective effort, they heaved it open, revealing a steep set of stone steps leading down into a dark, musty-smelling root cellar. Marshal Yates took a lantern and descended into the darkness, his revolver held ready. The air in the cellar was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. At first, it seemed to be a normal cellar, with shelves of preserved vegetables and barrels of what he assumed was ale. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of empty crates, was a series of large, lidded pickling crocks. A sense of profound dread washed over the marshal. He slowly, deliberately, lifted the heavy stone lid from the first crock. The lantern light fell upon the contents, and he had to physically recoil to keep from crying out. Inside, submerged in a dark brine, were human hands, pale and wrinkled. The next crock contained feet. The one after that held other, unidentifiable parts, all neatly sorted and preserved. This was their store of fresh ingredients, the raw material for their famous stew. The methodical, almost scientific organization of the horror was what truly broke him. It spoke of years, perhaps decades, of practice. This was their life's work. Back up in the common room, the posse gathered, their faces a mixture of rage, disgust, and stunned disbelief. They were simple men, and nothing in their lives could have prepared them for the level of evil they had unearthed. The final, damning piece of evidence was the stew itself. The blacksmith, his face now a mask of cold fury, took the massive iron cauldron off its hook and dragged it to the doorway, tipping its contents out onto the dirt. The thick, dark, viscous liquid poured out, and with it came chunks of meat and vegetables, and something else. Mixed in with the carrots and potatoes were human finger bones, small but unmistakable. Then, a human jawbone with several teeth still intact clattered onto the ground. The collective gasp from the men was sharp and visceral. The stew of blood was not a legend. It was a horrifying, literal truth. They had been feeding their victims to other victims. A closed, sustainable, and utterly demonic ecosystem of murder. At the sight of the spilled stew, Elias Finch, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion. It wasn't remorse, it was annoyance. "A waste," he muttered, shaking his head. "A perfectly good batch." The statement was so devoid of humanity, so monstrously casual, that it snapped the last thread of restraint in the posse. Two men lunged forward, ready to tear the brothers apart with their bare hands, but Marshal Yates stepped between them, his pistol raised. "No," he roared. "They will not have an easy death. They will face a judge. They will face the gallows. We will do this by the law." He would not let them become the monsters they were trying to destroy. The journey back to Springfield with the Finch brothers in custody was a tense and somber affair. The brothers were chained heavily and placed in the back of a wagon, the posse riding in a tight, protective circle around them. Elias was surprisingly talkative, but his words were cryptic and chilling, showing no remorse. He spoke of his customers as if they were livestock, referring to their quality and yield. He seemed to view their horrific acts as a simple matter of survival and business, a practical solution to the hardships of the frontier. Samuel, as always, remained silent. He sat impassively in the wagon, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, his face an unreadable mask. His silence was somehow more terrifying than Elias' monstrous chatter. It was the silence of a man for whom acts of unimaginable violence were as natural and unremarkable as breathing. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, an instrument of death. News of their capture spread like wildfire. As the posse passed through settlements, people emerged from their homes and shops to stare at the brothers. The crowds were silent, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They were looking at living, breathing monsters, the boogeymen from their darkest folktales made flesh. Marshal Yates could feel their hatred, their desire for immediate, violent retribution. He pushed his men and his horses harder. wanting to get the brothers to the safety of the Springfield jail before mob justice could prevail. He had to ensure that the full story was told, that the law was followed, so that the world would know and remember the depravity that had festered for so long in that lonely Ozark hollow. The trial of Elias and Samuel Finch was a sensation, drawing people from hundreds of miles away. The Springfield courthouse was packed every day, with crowds spilling out into the street, desperate to hear the gruesome details of the case. Marshal Yates testified, his voice steady and grim as he recounted the raid and the horrifying discoveries in the smokehouse and cellar. The boy who found the locket testified, his small voice trembling as he pointed out Elias Finch. Members of the posse took the stand, each adding another layer to the macabre tale. Throughout the proceedings, the brothers remained impassive. Samuel never spoke a single word. Elias, however, seemed to revel in the attention. When he took the stand in his own defense, he did not deny the charges. Instead, he spoke with a chilling and articulate calmness, attempting to justify their actions. He talked about the harshness of the frontier, the survival of the fittest. He claimed they were simply harvesting a resource that was plentiful and transient. "Men and women came to our door," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. "They were weak alone, their journey's end already written. We simply provided the final chapter. We wasted nothing. In this land, waste is the only true sin." His confession was not an apology. It was a horrifying philosophical treatise, the manifesto of a monster. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only a profound and disturbing pride in their efficiency and self-sufficiency. The jury needed less than an hour to find them guilty on dozens of counts of murder. The judge, his face pale with revulsion, sentenced them both to hang. While the brothers awaited their execution, a final, horrifying chapter of their story was written back at the Hollow. The people of Pine Ridge and the surrounding communities, unable to live with the knowledge of what that place represented, decided to wipe it from the face of the earth. In a solemn and grim procession, they marched on the abandoned tavern, carrying torches and cans of kerosene. They did not loot the building or take souvenirs. They wanted only to purify the land, to burn away the stain of the Finch's evil. They methodically doused the tavern, the smokehouse, the barn, splashing kerosene on the blood-stained floors and the cursed log walls. As night fell, the town elder said a prayer, asking God to forgive the land for the horrors it had witnessed. Then the first torch was thrown. The flames caught with a hungry roar, engulfing the structures in a massive pyre. The fire burned with an unnatural intensity, as if fueled by the decades of accumulated evil within. The greasy smoke from the smokehouse was replaced by the clean, purifying smoke of the inferno. The crowd watched in silence as the tavern that had been a trap for so many became a tomb for its own dark history. They stayed until the roofs collapsed and the walls fell in, until nothing was left but a heap of glowing, incandescent embers. They hoped that by destroying the physical place, they could also destroy its memory, its curse. But some evils are not so easily erased. The story of what happened in that hollow would become a part of the land itself, a forbidden legend whispered for generations to come. On the day of the execution, the town of Springfield was a somber, anxious place. A massive crowd gathered in the public square, their faces turned toward the newly constructed gallows. They had come to see justice done, to witness the final end of the cannibal brothers of the Ozarks. When Elias and Samuel Finch were led from the jail, a deathly hush fell over the crowd. Elias walked with a steady gait, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, a faint, condescending smirk on his lips. Samuel was, as ever, a silent, hulking presence, his expression blank, his eyes revealing nothing. On the gallows, they were offered a chance to speak their final words. Elias, ever the showman, stepped forward. He did not ask for forgiveness or pray for his soul. Instead, he looked out at the crowd and said, "You eat the pig, the cow, the deer. You see no sin in that. The world is a hungry place. We only ate what the world provided." His final words were not a confession, but a final, chilling indictment of the world that had condemned him. Then it was Samuel's turn. He had been silent through the arrest, the trial, and now his final moments. The crowd leaned in, waiting to hear the voice of the silent monster for the first time. He looked at Elias, then at the marshal, and then out at the sea of faces. He opened his mouth, and a single guttural word came out, raspy from disuse. "Hungry," he said. It was the only word he ever spoke publicly. It was a confession, an explanation, and a curse all in one. The hangman placed the black hoods over their heads, and a moment later the trapdoors sprang open. The reign of the Finch brothers was over. The execution of the Finch brothers brought a sense of closure, but it did not bring peace. The horrifying details of their crimes had unsettled the entire region, planting a seed of paranoia and mistrust that would linger for decades. Travelers became more wary, and the open hospitality of the frontier was replaced by a more cautious, guarded approach to strangers. The story itself became a piece of banned folklore. Parents used it to frighten their children into behaving, a grim cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk behind a smiling face. But for those who were directly involved, the men of the posse, the families of the victims, the horror was a fresh, open wound. Many of the posse members were haunted for the rest of their lives by what they had seen in the smokehouse and the cellar. They suffered from nightmares, a deep-seated revulsion to certain foods, and a profound sense of disillusionment with the nature of man. The site of the tavern itself became a cursed place. The forest quickly moved to reclaim the clearing, but locals claimed that nothing would ever grow on the spot where the tavern's foundation lay. They said that on still nights, you could still smell the faint, greasy odor of the smokehouse on the wind, and that the ghosts of the vanished travelers still wandered the hollow, searching for a piece they would never find. The mystery of the true number of victims was never solved. Authorities estimated, based on the sheer volume of remains and personal effects found, that the brothers could have killed anywhere from 20 to well over 100 people over the course of 2 decades. The true count was lost to the fire and the brothers' silence, a final, disturbing secret they took with them to the grave. In the years that followed, the legend of the stew of blood became a fixture of Ozark lore, a story that blurred the line between historical fact and macabre fairy tale. Each telling seemed to add a new, more horrifying detail. Some said the brothers were not merely men, but demons sent to prey on the faithful. Others whispered that their father had made a pact with a dark entity in the woods, trading his soul for a promise that his family would never go hungry again, a promise that his sons fulfilled in the most monstrous way imaginable. The physical evidence of the case, the locket, the marshal's reports, the trial transcripts, were stored in the county archives, but the emotional and psychological evidence was seared into the collective memory of the community. The story served as a brutal reminder of the thinness of the veneer of civilization on the frontier. It showed how easily human beings, stripped of society and its rules, could revert to the most primal, predatory instincts. The Finch brothers were not an anomaly. They were a product of the profound isolation and lawlessness of their environment. They created their own society in that lonely hollow, with its own grotesque set of rules and its own horrifying economy based on murder and cannibalism. They were a dark mirror held up to the face of manifest destiny, reflecting the hidden horrors that lay beneath the optimistic surface of westward expansion. Their story is a chilling testament to the fact that the greatest monsters are not the bears or the wolves in the woods, but the ones that walk on 2 legs, offer you a warm meal, and smile while they do it. The legacy of Marshall Brody Yates was forever defined by the Finch case. He was hailed as a hero, the man who stared into the abyss and did not blink. He had followed his instincts, pursued a cold case built on rumor and fear, and brought 2 of the most prolific murderers in the history of the frontier to justice. Yet the case took a heavy toll on him. He had seen the absolute depths of human depravity, and it changed him. He became a quieter, more somber man, his eyes holding the haunted look of someone who has witnessed things that can never be unseen. He rarely spoke of the case publicly, and when he did, it was in short, clipped sentences, as if he feared the memories would consume him if he gave them too much air. He continued his career as a lawman, but with a renewed and sorrowful understanding of the darkness that men carry in their hearts. The case also raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil. Were the Finch brothers born monsters, their cruelty an innate part of their being? Or were they twisted into their horrifying shape by their reclusive upbringing, by the teachings of their equally disturbed father, and by the brutal, unforgiving environment in which they lived? It was a question with no easy answer. Elias, with his articulate and philosophical justifications, seemed to represent a cold, intellectual evil. Samuel, with his brutish silence and relentless work, embodied a more primal, instinctual form of monstrosity. Together, they were a complete and terrifying picture of evil's many faces. They were not just a historical cold case. They were a timeless example of the horrifying potential that lies dormant within the human soul. Decades after the fire, long after the Finch brothers were dead and buried, a historian exploring the old county archives stumbled upon a forgotten piece of the puzzle. It was a dusty ledger from the general store in Pine Ridge, dating back to the 1840s when the brothers were just boys. The ledger detailed the purchases made by their father, Old Man Finch. The entries were sparse: flour, salt, coffee, but one set of entries stood out. Over the course of several years, Old Man Finch made regular purchases of a specific, and at the time, expensive, blend of herbs and spices. The combination included nightshade, wolfsbane, and other herbs known in folk medicine for their potent sedative and disorienting properties. The quantities were too large for personal medicinal use. The historian cross-referenced this with the trial transcripts and the testimonies of travelers who had survived the tavern, who spoke of feeling unnaturally drowsy or disoriented after eating the stew. The horrifying realization dawned. The family recipe likely included more than just a macabre main ingredient. The brothers and their father before them may have been drugging their victims with the stew, rendering them weak, confused, and easy to overpower. It was a final, chilling detail that made their operation even more insidious and calculated. They didn't just rely on brute force. They used cunning and poison, lulling their victims into a stupor before leading them to the slaughter. The stew was not just the meal. It was the first stage of the hunt, a chemical trap laid for the weary and unsuspecting. The evil in that hollow was even more methodical, more scientifically horrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The story of the Finch brothers serves as a powerful and disturbing counter-narrative to the romanticized version of the American West. We often think of the frontier as a place of heroism, adventure, and rugged individualism. But for every story of a brave pioneer, there is a darker, often untold story of those who preyed on them. The vast, lawless expanses of the West were the perfect hunting ground for predators of the human variety. Men like the Finches could operate for years, their crimes hidden by the sheer scale of the wilderness and the transient nature of their victims. The people they murdered were often alone, with no family nearby to raise an alarm when they went missing. Their disappearances were easily blamed on the natural dangers of the trail, allowing the true culprits to continue their gruesome work undetected. The Stew of Blood is more than just a creepy campfire tale. It is a stark reminder of the brutal reality of frontier life. It highlights the vulnerability of those who journeyed into the unknown and the horrifying ways in which that vulnerability could be exploited. The Finch brothers were an extreme example, but they were part of a larger, shadowy history of frontier violence that is often overlooked. They represent the darkness that traveled west alongside the wagon trains, a primal evil that found a home in the isolated hollows and untamed forests of a nation still in its infancy. Their tale is a forbidden chapter in the story of America, a testament to the fact that the price of expansion was often paid in blood. What ultimately makes the case of the Finch brothers so profoundly disturbing is the element of domesticity. This was not a frenzied, chaotic rampage. It was a cold, organized, and sustained operation that was integrated into their daily lives. The murder, butchery, and cannibalism were their chores, their business, their way of life. They greeted travelers, made them a meal, and then processed them with the same dispassionate efficiency a farmer would use with his livestock. The tavern was both a home and an abattoir. The cauldron in the hearth was a symbol of both nourishment and death. This grotesque fusion of the domestic and the demonic is what elevates their story from a simple tale of murder to something far more psychologically horrifying. It violates our most fundamental understanding of what a home and a meal are supposed to represent: safety, comfort, and community. The brothers twisted these concepts into instruments of terror. They used the universal human need for food and shelter as a weapon, turning the very symbols of hospitality into a lure for a death trap. This is why their legend has endured, whispered in the dark corners of the Ozarks for over a century. It's not just about the cannibalism, it's about the betrayal. It's the horrifying idea that the hand that offers you a bowl of stew to warm you could be the same hand that leads you to the slaughter. It's a story that taps into a deep, primal fear, that evil can wear a welcoming smile, and that a place of sanctuary can be the most dangerous place of all. Today, the exact location of the Finch Tavern is lost to time. The old trail has long since been overgrown, reclaimed by the relentless advance of the Ozark forest. Cartographers and local historians have tried to pinpoint the location based on Marshall Yates' reports and old maps, but the landscape has changed too much. The hollow is out there somewhere, sleeping under a blanket of trees and soil. There is no marker, no monument to the horrors that transpired there. There is only the story. And perhaps that is for the best. Some places are too soaked in tragedy, too stained with evil to be revisited. The burning of the tavern may have destroyed the physical structure, but it could not destroy the psychic scar left on the land. The story remains as a warning, a piece of American Gothic that is all the more terrifying because it is true. It reminds us that the shadows of history are long and that they often conceal truths that are too disturbing for the light of day. The tale of the brothers who served a stew of blood is a cold case that can never be fully closed, because the most important questions can never be answered. We know what they did, and we know how they did it, but we will never truly know why. We can never fully comprehend the psychological landscape that allowed such a monstrous reality to take root and flourish in two human beings. And it is in that unknowable space, in that silent, dark hollow of the human mind, that the true horror of the Finch brothers lies. The unresolved questions are what give the story its chilling power. How did their father, Old Man Finch, die? Did his sons murder him to take over the family business? Or did he simply pass on his horrifying legacy to them? Was there anyone else involved? Could there have been others in the isolated hills who knew of their secret and through fear or complicity remained silent? And what of the victims? How many were there truly? The official records account for around 24 confirmed disappearances linked to the trail, but the sheer amount of remains discovered suggests the number was far, far higher. For every Jedediah Kane or Schmidt family whose absence was noted, how many nameless, solitary travelers vanished without anyone ever knowing they were gone? Their stories ended in that dark tavern, their names and faces forgotten, their bodies rendered down into ingredients for a forbidden recipe. They became ghosts in their own time, their existence erased by the methodical evil of two brothers. The full scope of the Finch's crimes is a horrifying historical black hole, a void of information that can never be filled. All that remains are the bone-chilling fragments, the marshal's testimony, the newspaper clippings, and the enduring, macabre legend that still haunts the beautiful, lonely hills of the Missouri Ozarks. It's a story that proves that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of folklore, but of flesh and blood. In the end, the tale of the Finch Tavern is a ghost story where the ghosts are real. It is a testament to a time and a place where the veil between civilization and savagery was terrifyingly thin. The hollow where the tavern once stood is now just another anonymous patch of woods, indistinguishable from the countless other hills and valleys that make up the Ozarks. There are no ruins, no weathered signposts, nothing to indicate the profound evil that once called that place home, but the story persists. It is carried on the wind, whispered in the rustling of the leaves, embedded in the very soil. It serves as a grim and eternal reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that even in the most beautiful of landscapes, the darkest corners of human nature can create a hell on earth. The brothers are long gone, their bodies turned to dust, but their legacy of terror remains. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely road, deep in the heart of an ancient wilderness, and you see a flickering light in the distance promising warmth and shelter, you might do well to remember the story of Elias and Samuel Finch, and the disturbing, horrifying mystery of the brothers who served the stew of blood. For some family recipes are banned for a reason, and some hungers should never, ever be fed.